everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar From Insight to Action, Leveraging Analytics for Serious Injury or Fatality Prevention in Mining. My name is Cassie Bolter and I'm the Events and Partnership Manager at Centis. Today's presenter is Centis's Chief Strategy Officer and Head of Risk Advisory, Alex Fernando. Alex is responsible for the strategic growth of Centis, included in the development of Centis's critical risk climate diagnostics, incident analytics diagnostics, and critical control assurance programs. Alex is an experienced business leader and management consultant with experience across a diverse range of high-risk industries. Thanks again for joining us. I'll now pass over to Alex.
Thanks, Cassie. And you probably, with such an introduction, you probably forgot to mention that I'm a recovering engineer as well. So don't hold that against me, everyone.
Don't want to tell people that.
Just before we start, I thought I just want to do a acknowledgement of country, and we acknowledge the traditional custodians throughout Australia and recognise their connections to land, water, and community. We also acknowledge the traditional owners on the land which we meet today. I'm in Melbourne, so I pay respects to elders of past and present, and of course, all of you who may be across the country in different parts of the world as well. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, in particular, people here today who might be participating in this webinar. And we do this because we value Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history, culture, and knowledge. As far as Centis's own commitment to this acknowledgement, we divert a lot of our profits into land preservation projects, which some of you may or may not be aware of. We've invested more than $2.5 million in purchasing, restoring, and recovering over 400 hectares of land to sanctuaries, really with the aim of preserving natural heritage and creating a positive impact on the environment and local communities. And for those of you who aren't aware of who Centis is, our mission is to change the lives of individuals and organisations for the better every day. And we do this through sharing our knowledge in terms of our training, interventions, coaching, but inviting conversations for people during our programs and combining what you know of your world and the world of work with our knowledge of the brain, psychology, leadership, and team dynamics. And so really our intent is not to tell you how to do your job, but really to offer different ways of thinking and encouraging people to take control of their lives through the way we think and act. As far as the work we do work globally, predominantly across high-risk industries. Got quite a large team of consulting psychologists, as well as very deep expertise in critical risk as well. If you need any more info, please feel free to jump onto the website as well. So as far as what we're going to cover off today, it is a case study. I'm going to give you a bit of a sense of our approach to the work we do, bit of insight into the client context. There's a lot of data to kind of unpack, and I'm clearly trying to make something relatively dry, as engaging as possible. So really guided by the questions that you might prompt through the Q&A chat on the side here as well. Give you a sense of the client's strategy in terms of how they responded to the data, and give you a sense of some of the impact that they saw as well. So as far as our approach is concerned, we're very much guided by the principles of positive safety, and probably the definition that I anchor on is around safety is not the absence of accidents. It's more the presence of controls. And as Todd Conklin might say, the presence of defences. There is a yin and yang in this, and I think there's different schools of thought. And so what I might propose part of our discussion today is to think about the different schools of thought around lag indicators, but also leading indicators. And there is a bit of a mutual synergy between them. And obviously there's different schools of thought around this as well. It reminded me of this concept of yin and yang, which is a concept from Chinese philosophy, and very much talking about the interconnectedness and the mutual perpetuating forces that underlie that philosophy as well. And I don't take heedance on this as far as recordable incidents are concerned. And there are some big schools of thought around this, and I'm sure most of you are well aware of this. There's schools of thought around zero harm. This is quite often intended to be about returning people back home in the way they arrive to work, but quite often, sometimes in different organisational contexts, these things kind of have their own life, and so we tend to focus on reduction of injury, or the reduction of the absence of harm, so to speak. There are schools of thought around the randomness of data. There's statistical infidelity within the data as well. And of course, we've got the high-risk safety triangle, which of course what I'll propose to you is that it isn't predictive, but there is a school of thought that if you were to focus on very specific incidents, injuries, that you can actually extract a fair bit of deep learning out of this data. And so what I propose to you is that focusing on SIF potential, so this is the thin layer, a triangle within a triangle in some circles is what it's referred to. I think the likes of Exxon might call it mining the diamond. Other organizations call it different things. But really what we're proposing is that focusing on SIF potential, and SIF potential being a incident or a near miss that has the potential to cause serious injury or fatality potential. And so what we do is we look at a whole body of data and recognize within that body of data there are very particular either weak signals, near misses, minor injuries that if not for luck could have been a lot more sinister in the outcome. And so we're trying to separate out those high frequency, low severity incidents from those incidents that may be low frequency and high severity potential outcomes. There's a lot of industry studies that have been out there in the market over the years. And of course, there's a lot of references that we can give you with respect to this. But in effect, some of these industry studies have identified that about 20% of all incidents have the potential to be a SIF. Our own studies suggest somewhere between 17 and 20%. So, more orders of magnitude pretty much in line with each other. And what we do is use SIF potential as a leading indicator for exposure. And what this does is gives us a slightly rearview mirror approach, extract as much learning out of incidents that have occurred, but then also tie that into the proactive critical control management in the field. So it's almost a case of getting a sense of what might have gone wrong in the field, getting a sense of what might have contributed to that, and then combining that with our knowledge and understanding of how work is done in the field. Hopefully that makes sense. So one of the tools that we use in partnership with Incident Analytics is looking at a whole range of data, and I'll kind of unpack this as we go along. We'll take a body of historical incidents and near misses and try to differentiate between whether it was a SIF potential or a non-SIF potential. And really what we do is dive in deep to understand the risk context and get a sense of what was incident categorization looking like. Have we really maximized our learning opportunity by identifying those incidents that could, if not for luck, have had a different outcome? We do go deep into control, so we do actually have a very, very strong lens on critical control management. We've got a library of critical controls, and so what we do is we map those incidents from a critical control perspective and try to get a sense of, are those controls enabled? So are people set up for success? Are they not enabled? Are they difficult to implement themselves? And then as you get from the pointy end of the incident to more the blunt end, so to speak, we're trying to uncover human factors, local factors and organisational factors that may have had a sense of contributing elements to the outcomes that might have occurred. So the analysis process is quite rigorous, and I won't go into the depth of the other stages, but in effect what we do is we analyse the body of incidents and then use that to triangulate that data with critical control verification data in the field as well. So you're trying to bring in two pieces of data analytics together. In terms of what the data output looks like, there's a lot of data. There's a huge body of data that comes out. You can cut and dice the data by different means, and of course you read into the data in conjunction with the client. And so in this case, we're very much taking incident analytics data and then triangulating that with the organisation's own understanding of their context and the other data streams they've got, but also looking at safety culture data as well, which is something that we did over the course of the period of the analysis. So in terms of the client context, just a broad brush understanding of what the client does. They're very much broadly in the mining sector, everything from rail to maritime and shipping. So if you can think about the risk profiles there, you're bringing in stock via rail. There's stockpiling and separation and sorting, if you like, of those stockpiles of that commodity, and then shipping as well. So it's quite a complex operation, and the risk profile is quite broad as well. A bit more about this organisation. They were spun out of a very global organisation who had a critical risk management system that was consistent and uniform across the operations, but wasn't necessarily bespoke to this specific asset. And so when this asset was spun off, they found that they were operating under a risk management framework that wasn't really relevant to their operation. It didn't cover rail necessarily, it didn't cover stockpiling, didn't cover shipping and maritime necessarily in the way that they probably would have liked to have. They also saw that there was an improvement in lost time medical treatment injuries over the period, but they also found that their existing risk management processes didn't really adequately address severe and fatal risks. And so what they found was that there were gaps in critical control management in the field. Crews were using different tools that were almost legacy tools as well. So this was actually a client ripe for actually almost starting from a blank sheet of paper, and that's exactly what we did. We used several different techniques and analytical tools to set up the strategy, and I'll probably only have time to talk to one of them, and that's the incident analysis process. Of course, we've triangulated that with safety climate data, critical risk system reviews, cultural data in the field and things like that, and having lots of conversations with people as well. That may be the subject of another webinar, but I think for today what I'll do is focus on the review of the incidents over the period of 2018-2023, and then the analysis is actually continuing as we're still continuing this journey with the client. And we reviewed those incidents for severity potential. A subset of those incidents were considered to be serious injury and fatality potential events. So really what we're doing is we're now diving deep into the proportion of the events that were a SIF potential event. So hopefully that makes sense so far. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to drop questions into the Q&A, and I'll try and answer them as we're progressing. If I see that things are coming up for you, you might. But in the meantime, what I'd like you to do is just consider in your own organisation, what proportion of incidents do you feel are a SIF potential incident? Do you have a feel for it? Do you have a sense that they're one in every two incidents that occur, or near misses are a SIF potential, or some organisations call it high potential as well, or near miss, or near hit? Is it 1 in 3? Is it 1 in every 4? Is it even 1 in 20? So it'd be good to kind of get a sense from you in the webinar today as to what your thoughts and feelings are around this. So I think, Cassie, you'll be running a poll.
Yep, the poll is up. I will let it go for a few more seconds before I close it and share the results. All right, I'm going to close that down now and share the results.
Excellent. Okay. So I'm not sure if everyone can see the data there, but poll 1 looks like people perceive that there seems to be a focus in on 1 in 3 seems to be 1 in 10. So so it looks like we're seeing a fair few people thinking that it's around the 1 in 10 mark to the 1 in 20 mark, but it's obviously quite varied in everyone's experience as well. What I'll share with you with this client is a fair bit of the data now. Now, of course, there's a lot of data to unpack. And if you think about your own experience or your perception of how data is classified, or even your experience or feeling or gut instinct as to what proportion of incidents are SIF potential, this client was seeing roughly 1 in 6 incidents had a serious injury or fatality potential. So that's fairly significant in the sense of exposure in the field. Was that out of every 6 incidents, there was at least 1 that had the potential, if not for luck, and a few different things changing in that context that could have actually been far more sinister. So when we did the deep dive on those incidents that were SIF potential, what we found was that we effectively used it as a risk profiling tool. We found that a lot of these SIF incidents, SIF potential incidents, occurred in the high-risk activities: working at height, falling object, motor vehicle, and uncontrollable release of energy. You can see a bit of data there on the screen. I won't jump into the detail of each one of those, but on the right-hand side, what you can see is also a sense of whether people were set up for success. Were they enabled? Were the control implementation difficult or not enabled? So what this enables us to do is we've understood our risk profile as far as where exposure is in the field. We've now got a sense of, are people actually set up for success? Are they enabled, or are those critical controls difficult to implement or are they unenabled? Another way of looking at this is that work as imagined, so to speak, in the way we think controls can be implemented. When you go in the field and actually unpack from an incident review mirror, quite a large proportion of these controls weren't enabled by the field. They're difficult to implement as well. So it gives us a sense of, what do we do next as it relates to these high-risk activities? A bit more on the data. So what I'm going to show you now is we talked about that SIF classification. So when we started the journey with this client, we found that about 81% of their SIF potential incidents were classified well below the radar. And this is, so it might have been at low or moderate, as opposed to, major, if you like. What this means for people who are both operationally, but also from a leadership perspective, is that things are going under the radar. You get your data, and because there is a lack of insight or reliability around the data, you're starting to provide resources, time, attention to incidents that are not only on the radar, they're kind of missing a whole bunch of incidents that are actually below the radar as well. What we found over the period of that analysis is that actually increased up to 87%. So again, over the period of the work we were doing in partnership with this client, for whatever cognitive bias, the way the incident classification system worked, or maybe the way governance worked in that organisation, that process of being able to differentiate between SIF and non-SIF is obviously, clearly there's work to be done. On the flip side, what we're finding at the start of the journey was that around 47% of these incidents that were by the organisation classified as high major were non-SIF potential, and they were deserving a lot of disproportionate levels of attention, lots of ICAMs and taproots and all that kind of stuff, when the outcomes were relatively low severity, high frequency kind of incidents. So they were getting this amazingly disproportionate level of attention, when if you look on the left-hand side, there's 81 to 87% of incidents that are actually have room for much more organisational learning, but they're under the radar and not getting the warranted kind of attention that they deserve. So hopefully that makes sense. That's not to suggest that you shouldn't focus on high frequency, low severity incidents. We do care about people getting hurt, but the example I would give you is that someone rolls their ankle walking down a lane, someone rolls their ankle falling off a ladder. Two different risk contexts. One potentially, if not for luck, could have had a much more sinister outcome. And so what we're saying is, maximize your learning out of SIF potential incidents. And of course, the things that you do to treat low severity, high frequency injuries is different and requires deserved attention. But what we propose is that we actually start shifting some of our focus to be more proportionally weighed towards where we can maximize learning. And so what we found over the course of the 4 years was that the organisation started to make a bit of a shift, in that they were starting to focus on those incidents that were more SIF potential in effect. Some other cuts of data, and there's loads of data here, so I'm hoping not to overwhelm you with this. We talked about control enablement, and so in this data set, what I wanted to share with you is, over the course of the study, we found that on the left-hand side, non-vehicle incidents, so working in heights, falling objects, uncontrolled release of energy, so to speak, they had quite a large proportion of enablement. So people were set up for success on, let's say, 50-50, 3% on the slide, might be a bit small for you to read, where there were other causal factors or contributing factors that contributed to the outcome being a near miss, if you like. But by and large, those incidents had people set up for success. But by the same token, you've got, the remaining the remaining incidents were either difficult or had a high degree of difficulty in control implementation. With vehicle incidents, slightly different risk contexts, we found that there was a large proportion of enablement. And so once again, this starts to give you a bit of a sense of what are the organisational factors, local factors that got in the way of setting people up for success. And on the flip side, what is it about human factors that could have better enabled those controls to be put in place? So that's probably a snapshot of data, a thin slice of data. But what I want to talk to you now is, well, what did the client do with this data? So really, in effect, what we did was we used the Centis model of the safety culture model. And one of the things I wanted to chat to you about was that safety is a socio-technical thing. It's a socio-technical system, if you like. And so this model actually helped amplify the importance of leadership, environment, and practices. So practices being, the procedures and processes are actually in place. People have got the right training. People are set up success from that perspective. Environment being things like, engineering controls, the things that kind of enable you to implement those controls as well. Required tools and equipment and things like that. The person component is all about being switched on and fit for work and clear on critical risks and controls. That you're also willing to speak up when you either need to start the job with the controls being in place, and if they're ineffective, you're comfortable to be able to pause the work itself, and that you're collaborating on closing gaps and learning and improving. And of course, this is all surrounded by leadership, and leadership is pretty key, obviously, as I'm sure you can all appreciate, for enabling that controls are they're enable people are set up for success, but also their understanding of role in terms of implementing verifications of those controls as well. And all of this is wrapped in culture as well. A whole much more to unpack on that one, but if you want more details, just use the QR code to unpack that methodology if you like. So the key question is, what did the organisation do? So I've only showed you some of the data, but clearly what it lends itself to is, we need to look at our critical risk framework. What they did there was they ran a whole bunch of bow ties in those critical risk areas, identified the preventative and mitigative controls, and recast their critical control performance standards. One of the other key elements was increasing role clarity and engagement of the workforce, both at the leadership level, the exec level, and also the crews themselves who are on the tools, and ensuring that the experts who know these risk areas are actually heavily involved in the process as well. We introduced some new leading indicators, so clearly SIF potential, and I'll talk about CCVs in a second, so critical control verifications, but that was a key enabler to draw attention to our data, but also looking at coaching in the field. So that was actually pretty key in this in terms of workforce engagement and actually embedding those practices with both leaders and teams as well. We also continued the journey of assuring the data as well. So providing that feedback and providing a third-party view of the data was actually pretty key. So I won't go into this into depth, but this is effectively their critical risk framework. Instead of showing you a whole bunch of dry paperwork, this is probably the most engaging piece of it in terms of visuals. It gives you a really good sense of the risk profile. Probably the odd one standing out is that emergency response preparedness isn't necessarily critical control in and of itself. It's something that supports all of these risk activities. What they found was culturally was that emergency response preparedness was actually requiring a bit of a boost and amplification of attention. And so we created more of a focus on emergency response preparedness because that was really the common theme that ran through that had a bit of room for improvement. Role clarity was really important. So making sure that crews, frontline leaders and HC support people kind of obviously very understanding of the role they play in managing critical risk. And of course, enablement. So we talked about enablement being, were people enabled to implement those controls? Were they difficult and non-enabled? And so this became a point of query when leaders were out there verifying controls and really trying to get a sense of, are people set up for success, and trying to shift away from a tick the box kind of approach as well. One of the key things was equipping leaders with the ability to approach critical control verifications from a learning perspective, so that we're creating that psychologically safe environment where you're not evoking a threat response. The data also pointed to certain human factors, and this isn't about blaming the worker, this is about just acknowledging that error is human on the bottom right. And it was important just to understand that some of the work that we looked at from a historical perspective, we found there were patterns and themes around human factors that we needed to inform how we either redesign the work or ensure that we're providing more cross-checks or nudges in the work we do to address some of these issues. And of course, leveraging data around critical control verifications was really key. So do we have enough of a coverage of the risk areas? Are we doing our control verifications? Are they, what proportion of those CCVs that are unscheduled versus scheduled from a safety perspective? and what does it look like from a conformance perspective in terms of work as imagined versus work as done from a learning perspective. So it's not to kind of go, well, hey, let's chase leaders to do more verifications. It's more a case of trying to learn, well, where do we drive our attention and focus? So, quick question for you. Where do you feel you can improve your own critical control management within your organisation? Is it data analytics? Is it workforce engagement? Are there leading indicators that you can kind of consider? Do you feel that you need to do more work in identifying critical controls? So just a bit of a poll question around that. If you can give me a sense of what that looks like for you, that'd be fantastic. Is that poll up now, Cassie?
Yep, poll is up. People are answering. I'll leave it up for a few more seconds before I close it down and share the results. Okay, I will share the results now.
Yeah, look, that's interesting, isn't it? So yeah, we probably see similar themes where workforce engagement needs a lot more work. Quite often, critical risk is seen as a very technical space. And so what we found is that, focusing on the human enablement of those controls, engaging leaders and teams is pretty key. Now, identifying the critical controls as well looks like a bit of a theme there as well. Sometimes I found that organizations set and forget. They might do their bow tie analysis and it's set and forget, and there's almost assumption that our risk profile is what it is and we don't necessarily go back and revisit things. So look, as far as impact's concerned, I'm conscious of time as well. Probably the most heartening of the results, purely from the lens of SIF exposure, so SIF exposure being the proportion of incidents, if not for luck, that could have been a SIF potential incident, we found that working hours and incident reporting was actually fairly healthy and consistent across the period of the study. What we found was that SIF exposure actually reduced dramatically over that period of time. And we're still obviously working with this client, and there's obviously lots of things to do. This is kind of one of those areas where you need to kind of instill a bit of a chronic unease around this space. But this data here gave us a really good sense of confidence that we're getting really good exposure and engagement with the workforce. There is an acknowledgement around SIF exposure, and the improvement strategies are actually working. So progressively over the period of time, we're shifting from a relatively high SIF exposure. So we talked about roughly 20% being the global benchmark, if you like. Around 17% is what we generally see. This organisation started around 16 and then came down to around that 10% mark. Probably more better visual infographic is that we've shifted it from 1 in 6 to about 1 in 9. Still lots of work to be done. And so this probably, it lends itself, well, where to next? So clearly we've still got 1 in 9 incidents being a SIF exposure, and that's only as work as reported that might have gone slightly off tangent. There's obviously work that gets done 99% of the time that, if not for luck, things just actually are lucky. So really trying to combine and triangulate near miss data or SIF data with your CCV data is something that we would promote. And this is something that the organisation's working on as well. Getting better coverage of verifications across the risk areas is something that really needs to shift and change. Getting better engagement with the risk owners as well is work yet to be done. We are focusing and finding that there are themes around some of those human factors that are still quite prevalent from the start of the study to right now. And so we're starting to focus on, well, what do we need to do to either redesign the work or create greater cross-checks within the work, or even increase the amount of critical control verifications in the work itself. One of the questions that came through in the Q&A was around what are the organisational factors that might have contributed to this as well. We did see a very strong theme around risk assessment process and investigation capability at the start of our journey with the client, but also still being a similar theme in terms of an organisational factor that still needs to be worked on. So that's clearly an area for focus. So with all that being said, probably the key takeaways for you is that it's really important to have a shared understanding of critical risk activities and a current view of it. Quite often these things are set and forget, and you end up having tools and frameworks that probably reflect a risk profile that was yesteryear. But these are journeys, and so quite often we find that work practices change, workforce changes, technology changes, and so just getting a pulse on what your risk profile is pretty important. Leadership engagement in SIF potential, so using it as a learning opportunity. So looking at that rearview mirror from a near miss perspective, but then also tying that data in with proactive control verification data, and then giving a sense of, well, where do I need to focus my limited resource, time, and attention? Leverage data analytics clearly is the opportunity for most organisations. I think that was evident in the poll as well. But underpinning all this is fostering a culture of psychological safety. So healthy reporting is really key for SIF potential near-miss data reporting. So if you don't quite have a healthy level of reporting, I'd probably suggest focusing on the culture of reporting before you start doing any more deep dive analytics on this space rather. But also making sure that we can rely on your reporting of incidents and classification, because quite often, as we notice, that things slip under the radar. And so what drives and deserves attention of leaders is things in that major category. So if you'd like to get more information about critical control assurance, there's a white paper, which I think Cassie might throw up a poll there if you want more information about that. And if you do, click yes. That'll give you a bit more context around some of the concepts that we're talking about as well. Can I click on the next one, Cassie?
Yep, I'll close that down. You can go to the next one.
And the last one being, as we draw to a close, is a meta-incident analysis. So clearly there's a lot to cover off in this webinar, and clearly there's more info to kind of cover off. But if you want more information around the meta-incident analysis, feel free to express your interest there. We do have a couple of questions. I've run out a bit of time, but what I will do is I will circle back with responses to those questions and maybe even make them the subject of the next webinar. So yeah, really appreciate everyone's time. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. You've got my contact details there as well. Looks like we've run out of time for Q&A. Cassie?
No, we've still got a bit of time.
Oh, we do? Okay,
yeah,
good.
you've done very well with time today.
Fantastic. Excellent.
So if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A box. I'd like to thank you, Alex, for presenting for us today. And I also wanted to let the audience know that our next webinar will be on the 28th of March, which is simplifying psychosocial risk management. I haven't had any new questions come in. Would you like to answer some of the pre-questions that we've had?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a really good question around whether any insights from data analysis related to human error or non-compliance to engineering maintenance, safety standards and procedures, and can you share these in the webinar? So yeah, really appreciate the question, because that's quite a big question. But what I did was I prepped up some data for us. Am I still sharing the screen? Looks like I am.
Yep, we can see
There's the question on the left-hand side. So I mentioned before with the analytics process is that at the pointy end, it's really clear around whether it's a SIF yes or SIF no, knowing the risk context. It's really clear to understand what the control architecture needs to look like around absent or ineffective controls. And then as you get to the more blunt end of the incident analysis, we're starting to get more of thematic analysis, because we're analysing hundreds and hundreds, in this case 700 or so, 659 incidents. So the most prevalent theme that was contributing from an org factor perspective was safety, so risk assessments and work procedures. So really work as imagined and work as done didn't reflect the work procedures themselves. And that's almost directly out of the control of the person actually doing the work. So we would deem that as being an organisational factor more broadly. But risk assessments is the area that the organisation has pursued the most in. There is another piece of data which I thought I'd share with you, but might get a bit heavy, and that's this slide here. Is it coming up? It is, okay. And I'll point to, so the bit that I spoke to was organisational factors. They were the most, and I'm using my mouse here, organisational factors that were the most significant issues at the start and towards the end was definitely procedural integrity and risk assessment capability as well. And that's more around possibly capacity as opposed to capability, but it actually could be capability as well. So that's something the organisation is working on. We did find that there was quite a high degree of risk tolerance at the local level in the operation. So an area, again, that we need to kind of zoom in on as well. So yeah, just hopefully that answers that question with a bit more data to give you a sense of what that looked like.
Perfect, thank you. I think we did have another question. Have you answered the question 2 that came through?
Oh yeah, I can see it. So how would you propose to use the MIA analysis in isolation of other work streams? Okay, all right. Yeah, so the meta-incident analysis is typically used either as a risk profiling tool, and you can actually do a much lighter touch analysis to do that, or you can go a bit deeper if you wanted to get more of a sense of how do we strengthen controls. Quite often it's used as data that informs bow tie analysis. So if you're looking to recalibrate or redo your bow ties around any critical risks, having a look at incidents that have occurred historically and looking at how the controls may have broken down, been made more ineffective, been ineffective, is actually really useful data to inform a bow tie process. So when you're mapping out your bow ties and you're looking at preventative and mitigative controls, having a look at historical data around what can we learn around how controls were either ineffective or absent is really, really good lens to use. The other use is quite often we work with boards, and so they will ask us to give a third-party kind of independent view of what's the risk profile in the organisation, what can they, what do they need to tune into from a board perspective. Typically, it's about instant classification and governance around the data, as distinct from getting involved in the details. So typically, the safety team might be more involved in the controls and downstream, but boards and execs tend to focus on the classification and governance of data.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alex. We haven't had any new questions come in, so I think we might wrap it up there. But I'd like to thank everyone for, on behalf of Centres today, for joining us, and thank you very much, Alex.
No worries. Thanks a lot, Cassie, and thank you everyone for tuning in.